everybody. Welcome to another episode of Do I Need a Bigger Mouthpiece? Today's a little bit different. I am recording this one solo because my co-host, Kevin Dugat, has just become a father. Obviously, we're all super excited for him as he starts this new journey of doubling that will be his new life. But in the meantime, he's going to take a couple weeks off the podcast. So I thought I would introduce this first week some information that might be useful. And I'll be honest, this is a little bit different to do as one person. And so I enlisted the help of everybody that participates in my Trombone Guide Instagram community. I posted a story about 6 days ago where I asked for feedback and questions that people might want answered. And then I did the same thing a couple days after that. And between all of that, I've collected a ton of questions that I think would be really pragmatic for us to talk about. And maybe these can provide some insight for you. I intend to do a lot more episodes like this in the future, these grab bag question style discussions. So without any further blabbering from me, I'll kick this one off. One of the first questions I got that I thought was really interesting is, how often do you take a day off? Now, I'm gonna kind of take that question and change its meaning a little bit and say, how often should one take a day off? Well, this is a contested question, so I guess I'll just share some of my thoughts and then I'll share some of the prevailing theories. Trombonists and brass players in general, and musicians in general, we are people that do a thing with our body for a living, and that thing that we do, well, it's not necessarily what our body was designed to do. In the case of trombone, the trombone is not the most ergonomic instrument that has ever been invented, right? We've got one shoulder up, one shoulder out, we're moving one arm, all of the weight of the trombone is balanced on one side of our body, we're taking deep aerobic breaths, we are buzzing our lips the whole time, we're trying to prevent any tension from existing between our throat and our solar plexus so that the air can flow freely and we're not being tight. This act that we're then going to do for a few hours a day regularly, I mean, my gosh, that's not something that we're designed to do. We adapt. Humans are very good at adapting. That's one of our defining characteristics as a species. But we do need rest. So I know a lot of people that treat days off in a very loose sense. If they're tired, they take a day off. And if they're not, they don't. I also know other people that treat days off as a facet of how they're feeling mentally. If they're burnt out, they take a day off. If they don't feel like practicing and they're really not in a good place, they take a day off. Those are all answers that work. Myself, I prefer to approach it very clinically. As an athlete, you take rest days when you're exercising to allow your body to recover. And to that end, I don't actually call my days off. I call them recovery days, and I build them into my schedule. So I follow a couple different principles, and I'll share them right now. So the first principle is that every week, every 7 days, I take a light day. Meaning if you take a schedule from like Sunday to Sunday, one day in there is going to be a light day. And for me, a light day is a warm-up that goes for about 35 minutes, and then about 35 minutes of fundamental playing. That's really easy stuff like lyrical playing out of the Brad Edwards book, the Lip Slur Melodies book, or the Rochu book. It's maybe a routine from my Trombone Guide material up on the website, tromboneguide.com. It's maybe some Marsteller with a light tongue or some Schlossberg, really soft slurs. And then I put the horn away. I don't play for more than an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes because that's a recovery day. I'm getting blood back in my face. I'm letting my chops kind of reacquaint themselves with an easy and effortless buzz. And then we're moving on. And I'm allowing my brain to do something else because it's a physical recovery day. Now, I'm not suggesting that on recovery light days, I am not giving my brain a workout. That's not necessarily a day that I'm going to go light musically. I might spend a lot of time listening, or I might do some composing, or I might, edit some parts. I might look at the rep I'm preparing and I might do some active listening with pencils and marking things in. It's not a time that I'm giving my brain a day off. I'm giving my face a day off. It's a muscle recovery decision. Now, we do need to give our brains time off too, because, thinking takes energy and your brain does get tired. And if you go too long without a day that's, recovery for that, you're going to burn out. and we want to avoid that too. So, to that end, every couple weeks, I'll take a full day off. And on a full day off, I might buzz for 10 or 15 minutes on the horn, stay within 1 octave range, and just do some really light lyrical playing without a tongue, and that's it. The horn goes away. Now you might ask yourself, well, come on, Alex, why don't you just put the horn in the case and not touch it all day? I do that sometimes, but I find that my face works better day to day if I don't take a full day away from the instrument. And so 10 to 15 minutes of just easy buzzing, that's not really a day of playing in any sense of the word, but it's enough to keep my body from feeling like I haven't touched the trombone in a day. So again, every couple weeks, maybe every 10 or 15 days, I have a day like that. Now, if you zoom out one more time and you look at the entire year, I think it's important to have a recovery period throughout the year where you don't play trombone, where you allow your brain to reset so you can reacquaint yourself with the instrument and maybe get a fresh start on some bad habits that have formed. Bud Herseth was famous for doing this. Bud Herseth, obviously principal trumpet in the Chicago Symphony for a very long time, almost 50 years. He would, as the story has been told, take 3 weeks off the trumpet every summer, and he'd go up fishing to his cabin, and he would not play, and then he would come back 3 weeks later, and he always talked about how his brain and his playing was refreshed from this experience. I try to take a week or two off every summer, somewhere in there. I don't touch the horn. For me, it's typically something I consider at the end of May, if I can do it. Recently, it's been pushed into mid-July because of ITF. I've been preparing for recitals in mid-May, so I haven't had that as an opportunity. But I really think it's important. It's important to take a week or two off the horn. And especially as you get older, as an adult, there are going to be things you have to do that make playing difficult. Maybe you need to have some dental work done. Maybe you have to have a surgery done. Maybe you have hurt your arm playing with your kids in the backyard, and you've got to go in and have some physical therapy, and the doctor says you need to be not playing for a couple weeks, get some recovery time in. Maybe you have some kind of procedure that you need to have done. Whatever it is, this is the reality of adulthood, and it is not a goal that is congruent with trombone playing all the time. So when it comes to your health wins out over the trombone. It just does. It might not in short bursts when you're trying to practice for an audition and you're kind of in crazy prep mode, but in living a life, you need to balance things. And that means that as an adult, things like a small surgery that knock you on your feet for 5 days, that's going to be a time you're not practicing because, well, your body's healing. And so for something like that, I recommend that you try and plan those 2 weeks or 3 weeks off the horn just to give your brain a break, your face a break, and life a chance to catch up. So those are my thoughts. I'll share this, one last final idea on this. It's really important to reframe the idea of time off versus recovery time. I am not a proponent of just taking time off because you feel like taking time off. I don't think that's necessarily the healthiest way to frame it when we are living a life where we're prioritizing our goals. I do think that you should never feel guilty once you've decided to take time off and you've planned it and then you do so. I know plenty of people that will take a day away from the horn and then halfway through they'll say, oh, I feel so weird about this. I feel guilty. I should be practicing. No, you should not. You've made the decision to take time off. And making that decision is a part of your practice prep. It's part of the process. You've actively planned a day to recover, and that is the optimal choice in taking a long-term view of your growth. So to that end, I would say take the critic in your mind and silence them, because beating your face into the horn every day for 5 hours nonstop is not the best way to win success. The best way to do it is to calculate your path and then monitor your trajectory as you continue to improve and build in safeties and recoveries, knowing that you will fail. You will make mistakes. You're human. Humans are fallible to making mistakes. And as long as you're aware of this, as you continue the process of improving, you have these recovery days, you have these catch-up days built in. You don't get to feel guilty about taking them. They're part of that process. It's just an intellectual decision for you to plan ahead. All right, let's move on. Here's another question I got that I thought was kind of interesting. It's a little bit equipment driven. What is the difference between all of the different kinds of valves you can get on a trombone? Well, I really should get an equipment expert on our podcast. I do know a couple of them that are quite knowledgeable in this. And because I keep such a close vicinity to a couple of them, I have a pretty decent working knowledge of this. So I'll share what I know here. Most trombone valves are rotor valves, and that means that the valve is a disc that has two ports in it, and it spins. And as it rotates, rotate, as it spins within the casing, the tubing changes directions, and the ports give you, path to different tubes. The advantage of a rotor valve is that it has the most efficient movement because a rotation is the easiest physical motion you can take on a spindle. It has the least drag because it's just rotating. And as long as it's oiled, it's a very efficient, quick throw that feels almost as tight as we can as compared to like a true tube, as if there was no gap at all. So you'll hear trombonists talk about a rotor being a tight valve. That's what they mean. It's worth mentioning that with valves, the rotor, for example, the ports in a rotor, while they do rotate, they also have bends in them. And what I mean is that it's not a completely straight tube. If you look at a rotor, there's an angled bend that kind of looks like a U. And then on the opposite side, there's a U as well, facing the other direction. And this is because your airstream, the column of air that you're playing with, needs to go through different ports depending on which way the rotor is spun. Now, when you're playing, you're used to feeling a certain degree of resistance and a certain direction of resistance in the air. And if that air column abruptly takes a turn, you feel that with the blow of the note. And this back pressure change definitely affects the way that the resistance is felt. And so when you hear people talk about a tighter or a more open valve, this is entirely to do with both the compression in the valve and the way the air backs up depending on the turns that the air has to take. If you look at old instruments by Kahn or Bach, they came in a closed wrap configuration, meaning the entire valve section tubing was wrapped within the shape of the actual bend in the main tuning slide. That creates a lot of turns for the air to go through, a lot of very sharp turns, and all of those individual angles contribute to the back pressure you feel. Somewhere in the 70s and early 80s, an open wrap instrument became more popular. And today you can buy Bachs and Kahns in open wrap or closed wrap configuration. The idea of an open wrap is just to make it feel, well, more open. Other valves have different kinds of compression based on both the compression of the actual valve and the way that the ports bend the air, the angles that they bend at. In terms of the PSI, the pressure that is stored inside a rotor, it holds very high pressure. Within the rotor world, we have, some different variances. We have dual bore rotors, rotors where the different ports have different bores so that it can progressively widen as you blow through it. Or we have rotors like the twin valve that Shires makes, which are two rotors that fire together, thereby only having one port in each. And that means that you have less mass in the rotor because you only have one port, so that obviously allows it to resonate lighter and feel less like a valve and more natural. And then there's also a rotor made by Greenhoe, which is what I play on right now, and that rotor is a really efficient rotor that happens to be designed in such a way that it seals at a very high PSI. It's incredibly efficient from an engineering perspective, and as a result, it's very tight and it feels very controlled and very reliable. The PSI seal of a rotor is obviously desirable, but it doesn't mean that something that has a lower seal is going to be less desirable. It's just different, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. The axial flow valve, or the Thayer valve, which was designed by Orla Thayer and originally put on Bachs, I think, in the 70s. The Thayer valve, credit where credit is due, is a valve that does not seal as well as a rotor valve. The seal on a Thayer is fundamentally less good because it doesn't rotate. It's not a circular rotating valve. It's actually built on a spindle, and it spins left to right, almost like a helix. If you can imagine a double helix, the ports on a Thayer valve are helix shaped, and the valve itself spins left to right, which gives you a really smooth rotation, albeit slightly slower. And that's why when you throw the valve on a Thayer, it feels slow. It feels like a longer throw. It is a physically longer distance. When the Thayer valve was originally developed, one of the greatest strengths of the Thayer was that the air traveling through the ports would not be bent at a greater angle than like 28 or 30 degrees. And because of that, it's going to feel much more open. Now, the Thayer valve also has a lower compression ratio than a rotor valve, so that affects it as well. But basically, between all of that, you get a really open flow with the Thayer valve. When you're playing on a Thayer valve, it leaks a little bit of air, but it feels like you can get more air into the slur. And it's because it's not such a tight seal, so it's not backing up with as much pressure. You can actually flow the slur really, really conveniently. And a lot of players, myself included, talk about Thayers making it really easy to get into the low register, the trigger register, because that slur is assisted by this free-flowing feel. Yeah, Thayer valves were immensely popular in the 90s and into the early 2000s. They're still very popular, particularly useful for players that play with a lot more air and a lot more open air flow in their setup. And a lot of bass trombonists like the dual Thayer valve because they play with so much flow. There are other types of valves. You know, the Shire's true bore valve is a really interesting valve. It's basically a big rotor, but instead of having a port in the middle that rotates, there's actually a pipe in there. And that pipe rotates with a longer throw than a normal rotor, but that throw literally meets adjoining sections of the pipe. And so what you're blowing through once the valve is thrown is still a continuous tube. It's slightly broken, but it's not broken into ports. It's a fully moving tube that rotates inside that valve casing. So the true bore valve feels very natural. And I remember distinctly when I was when I was younger, 2007, I was a senior in high school going to college. I went to the Shire's factory and I was fitted for a horn by Gabe Rice, who is now a professor at BU and a dear friend of mine. It was the first time I met him. At the time, he was the product specialist at Shire's that fit people for trombones. And I tried the true bore valve, which at the time was a patent pending new invention that they had just come up with. And I couldn't play the trigger E in second position. I kept missing it. And I was missing it because I had learned on my Bach that I had learned to play on to compensate, because I had to do something with my mouth to make that note speak because it was such an irregular feeling with the valve. But on the true bore valve, it felt the same as seventh position E, and then E flat felt as if you could just go out to eighth position. You didn't have to do anything. And so that adjustment was very strange for me. But for many players, particularly players that have clocked a lot of time on a straight horn, it can be a really great option. It feels very natural. So these are the differences in valves that I've noticed. And you know, there are other valves, obviously. You'll see lots of different variations on those two sequences. There's also the piston valve, which you can see on trumpets very commonly, and very, very rarely you'll see one on a French horn or a trombone. Piston valve has ports, and those ports change when you push the piston down. So there's no rotation. It's just a casing that goes in and out, and it moves at the speed of your finger pushing into the spring. So a piston valve is very fast indeed, but the change on a piston valve can feel a little abrupt because your change in port on a piston valve is dictated by your finger movement, not by a rod that throws on a trigger. So it's a very different mechanism. I hope that's helpful. There's a lot of information in there. Some of that is my opinion, but some of that is also just as things have been explained to me and as I found to be true in my teaching. Let's move on to another question here. When did you get serious, and what was the biggest thing that changed your practice when you were growing up? Okay. So I've talked about my path a little bit in our first episode. I grew up as a classical violinist. I played violin all the way through school. I started when I was very young, and I went all the way through to high school. I got serious about trombone when I was in high school. My violin teacher was like a very serious violinist and, you know, conservatory style teacher, and he moved. He took a job in Peabody, and so he moved down to DC, and I didn't have a teacher anymore. And so I tried trombone lessons, and I met a trombone teacher who is still a dear friend of mine and, you know, was my mentor growing up. I became serious because I wanted to be him. But I didn't really understand the culture of practice for a long time. I'll share a quick quote here. When I went through undergrad, I went to school at Ithaca, and Ithaca is a wonderful school. And at that time, it was a really excellent school, particularly for students that wanted a degree in education and performance, which is what I did. And there were a couple very serious players at Ithaca, but there were also some very not serious players at the same time. And I was blessed enough that my professor was an incredibly serious player, and he was a young man that had, taken the job after winning a couple jobs and after coming out of Juilliard. His name is Jeff Gray. He plays bass trombone in the Rochester Phil, and he teaches at Eastman. Jeff, oh gosh, he must have been maybe 27, 28, 29 when I studied with him. And he sat me down one day and he said to me, you need to look around and realize that this community that you're around, this is not the rest of the world. This is not the level at which you will be competing the minute you leave this school. You're a very good player here right now, but the minute you leave, you will not feel that way anymore. And there will be much better players all over the place that are younger than you. And that was a hard thing to understand until I saw it. But I got serious when I failed at graduate auditions. So I took my auditions at the end of my senior year, and I got into one school out of five, but I didn't get enough money to go anywhere. And I applied to really competitive schools, but I was good, but I wasn't that good. And I didn't know that. And my ego stood in the way of me realizing that until I failed. And when I failed, three very, very kind people stepped in and helped me. And well, actually, I shouldn't say three, it was four. Mark Kellogg, who I had taken some lessons with at Eastman, was there to comfort me and help me find my footing. Toby Oft and Steve Lang were both people I had really wanted to study with, and they had been really supportive, and they were very honest that I wasn't quite there, but I could make that change. And they both gave me paths forward, including agreeing to teach me on the side for years while I was teaching and getting myself into a place where I could be really a competitive player. And then Amanda Stewart, who I had taken some lessons with, who was also just really supportive. There's this idea of the crucible where when you get out of graduate school and you realize you don't really have much school left anymore. I mean, today people go on for performance diplomas or DMAs, but eventually you run into a place where you can't do any more school. And if you are planning to win an orchestral job, you eventually have to face the crucible. And that's the period of your life where you don't have direction other than auditions. And when you get there, all of the scaffolding that has held you together through institutions falls away. And suddenly you're alone in the ocean on a ship, and you're the navigator and you're the crew. And everybody goes through this shake-up period where for a couple months you don't practice as much as you should, or maybe you practice and get burnt out. And then you have a little bit of an existential crisis and you say, what the hell am I doing with my life? That's okay. That's all part of the plan. What Toby said to me that was so helpful when I was younger in this period was, he said, you're just going to do the crucible a couple years early. You're going to do it now. While everyone else is going off to grad school, you're going to take a couple years off and teach. You're going to pay off some loans. You're going to save some money. You're going to get good at trombone. And you're going to have your crucible early. So by the time you go to grad school, you're really going to be focused. And you're going to be knowing that this is what you want to do. And you're going to be super appreciative of the chance to go back and do it. And you're going to be adjusted to the real world. And you'll be a little older. And oh boy, was he right. I was not ready. I thought I was ready, but I wouldn't have appreciated it the way I did when I got to go back at 25 and a half, 26 years old and went to grad school after having taught for 3 years, saved up a lot of money, had gone through some life experiences, had worked really hard, 2 full-time jobs for like a couple years, just not doing much of anything other than working and practicing and taking lessons and just getting really, really good at being able to do that on my own. That's when I got serious, and that was the thing that changed my practice, was waking up and realizing that the answers have to come from you. And if you're not prepared to give those answers, or if you don't have them, it's because you're not ready to. And that might mean that this, the path that you think is for you isn't for you. But more than likely, what it means is that you are missing an experience in your life that you have to close on, that you have to learn from. And it might be that you've been in school your whole time and you've never been out of school. And it might be that you've never really experienced what it's like to have to self-motivate without the academic year motivating you. It might be that you've never had to balance a job and school at the same time. It might be that you've never come into contact with something that means as much or more to you than trombone does. Like your instrument's really important. Practicing, for many dedicated performers is the most important thing until a parent gets sick or something terrible happens in the family. Then all of a sudden, you're shaken to the realization that there are other things that are equally important, perhaps more important. Many would say definitely more important. But you don't come to these realizations right away. These are things that take life experiences. So it's a long-winded answer, but I think it's an honest one. Let's keep moving here. How do I build a private studio? Oh gosh, I get this question on the weekly basis from very well-meaning people that want to know how they do what I have done with Trombone Guide and how to find success teaching. It's a very long answer. It's not a short answer. It's not one thing that you're doing wrong. It's not one thing that I did right. It's not one thing that I figured out that you haven't. It's a combination of factors, and I'll try and simplify it as best as possible. When you teach lessons, you are running a small business. And the business that you're running is that you are offering a service in exchange for money. And to that end, you have to remember that the service you are offering has to have intrinsic and extrinsic value. Intrinsic meaning students will learn music from you, and that's really important, and they want that, and there's cultural value to that. And extrinsic in the sense that a parent or a student that is looking prospectively to study needs to choose you over other people. There are many reasons that students come to lessons. Some of them are artistic, some of them are pragmatic, some of them are literal. It doesn't matter why they're coming to lessons. They're looking for lessons, and you're providing lessons. So that's a good recipe for a business transaction. But why would a student or a teacher or even a parent choose you over a different teacher? Well, if you play in the New York Philharmonic and you teach at the Manhattan School of Music, that's a very good reason for someone to choose you. Your expertise and knowledge is way ahead of other people's. You are a master of the craft. And when you say, yes, I charge, I don't know, I'll pick out a number that's higher than what I know they charge, but I'll pick up $500 an hour. Ridiculously high, wonderful number. That's a prohibitively expensive number, but you can understand why someone might charge that money. They have extreme expertise. In the business world, there are people that charge $5,000 an hour for their coaching time because their time demands that kind of respect. And the knowledge they have, you can't get anywhere else. Well, if you're a student and you're an undergrad and you want to build a private studio to teach over the summers, and you put up a post saying that you want to teach lessons for $25 an hour, the reason that a student would take lessons with you is that you're cheap. That is what would take them to you from someone else. Understanding the value of what you offer in a literal extrinsic and intrinsic sense is a big part of success. For me, I teach students, and the value that I offer is that I can do things pedagogically in my teaching that are unique. And I help people find answers where they have not found answers previously. So the value of what I do that allows me to command success where maybe other people haven't found it is that what I do is different than everybody else. And there aren't that many people that do exactly what I do. So it's a scarcity model. What I offer is unique. My perspective is unique. If I charged $300 an hour, my perspective is unique, and it's people can verify that what I do is valuable, but it's maybe not that valuable. Maybe that's too prohibitively high a cost. So figuring out what you demand as a fee, what you're worth in an honest way, and then realizing if what you're valuing is something that people are willing to pay that money for because they can't get it other places, or they can't get it other places for that cost, or for that ease of access. And there are many things beyond money and value here too. There's it could be valuable to a parent to take a lesson with someone that lives 5 minutes down the road and can just show up at the house. It may be valuable to a parent to take a lesson with someone that will teach a 90-minute lesson, not a 60-minute lesson. Maybe a parent is only looking for a 20-minute lesson for their 5th grader. If you're offering 20-minute lessons, that could be really valuable. Maybe in addition to lessons, you offer a studio class online once a week. Well, that's added value. I do that. I offer a studio class and I don't charge for it. It's included. That's extra value. I mean, these are all considerations that you have to ask. Students pay me for a lesson every week, but they also get coaching on preparing materials for auditions, preparing materials for college auditions, summer festivals. They get assistance in doing embouchure changes or technical changes in their playing. They also get a studio class and they get mentorship and they get a community that they get to be a part of. And then there's the list of my successful students that have won jobs in, professional orchestras or in, found placement in good colleges or good grad schools and have gotten really fat scholarships that go along with that. That's kind of my receipts that help, but altogether it creates a value equation. So thinking about it that way will help you direct your thoughts to finding where you sit in the market as a niche and allowing you to then find success in attracting students. A lot of this requires quite a few bites of humble pie. You have to be honest. If you attend a really prestigious school and you're an undergraduate, it does not necessarily mean that you're a great teacher. It does not necessarily mean that you are a bad teacher, but you have to remember that trading on the name of the school you attend or the professor that you study with does not speak to your ability to translate knowledge to a student, which is the principal skill. Likewise, if you're an excellent teacher with a lot of experience teaching, but you don't play the horn very well and you don't really understand the trombone's workings very well, or you just are not good at explaining them in clear, concise ways, that also means that you won't necessarily be able to demand a lot of value, because all of these skills are important. Being a teacher that can really synthesize information and think at a deep level about communication to students is very important. Having a very high level understanding and technical ability on the trombone is equally important. If you have a personal training fitness coach that is not in very good shape, but they have extreme expertise, well, if they're older, that might make sense. You'd say to yourself, yeah, they're not in their prime anymore. They clearly were at one point. And in the same sense, if you have someone that's in incredibly good shape but doesn't have very good understanding of fitness, you might be remiss to train with that person, because while you probably would get in shape by doing whatever they do, you could get hurt. So these are all the thoughts that kind of surround this topic. And it's a bit dense, but I think that's about the best way I can synthesize it. Let's talk about the next question here. Who is your favorite trombonist? Oof, impossible question. Can't answer it, but I will answer this. I will share a few names of trombonists that I think are really underrated, maybe fly under the radar, that you should check out. I love John Cypher's playing. John Cypher is the principal trombone in Colorado Symphony. He's an incredibly thoughtful artist, and his sound is nothing like anybody else's. John plays on an old Conn 88H that sounds like liquid gold. His sound is completely unique, and it sounds electric, and I absolutely love it. And I fell in love with his sound when I first heard him when I was an undergrad, and he was playing in the Syracuse Symphony. Gosh, he must have been 26, 27 at the time. I took lessons with him because my teacher, Jeff Gray, recommended it. And he said, whatever you do, just try and learn how he makes that sound. Another player that I think is a true master at our craft is Steve Lang, my teacher at NEC, the second trombone in the Boston Symphony. Steve keeps a low profile compared to a lot of the top players in the world. His control of the instrument, particularly his soft playing, is so outstanding that if you were in the same room as him, you might gasp out loud in shock. I've done it. I've been in a studio class of Steve's with the entire rest of his studio, and he's demonstrated organ symphony, and everyone in the room just gasped. So I highly recommend listening to Steve's playing. Obviously, my mentors, other than Steve, Toby Oft has a sound that is like nobody else in this world and is truly an incredible artist that I think is pretty unmatched. Jeff Gray, bass trombone in Rochester, just an incredible player and human. I absolutely love Amanda Stewart's playing and the sound that she makes and the artistry that she plays with. I'm so glad that she's finally getting the recognition she deserves, because for many years she's been a trombonist that flies under the radar. The sheer color and energy and command that Sasha Romero can achieve playing is outstanding. Chance Gompert's natural control of the bass trombone and the way he makes everything that's impossible look easy. The articulation clarity that my friend Luke Seavey gets on the bass trombone is something I've always strived for. And there are many, many others. These are just names that come to my mind quickly. I highly recommend just taking the time to look around and listen to trombonists that you maybe haven't heard. There are a lot of gems in the trombone world that sound really great. And, not all of them get recognition because not all of them seek recognition. So do your due diligence, do some research. I always tell my students, if you go into like a high school baseball team and they're all hanging out on a Thursday after practice and they're doing a fantasy draft, every single person at that table knows pretty much every single MLB player in America in that year, what team they're on, what position they play. Many of them know their stats memorized. We all know people in our lives that have baseball stats memorized to an insane degree. So I would ask you, if you're planning to be a professional trombonist, can you name every trombonist in a major orchestra in America? There's not that many of them. There's maybe 150. Do you know who the second trombone in the Cleveland Orchestra is? Do you know who the second trombone in the San Francisco Symphony is? Do you know who the bass trombonist in the Jacksonville Symphony is? These names, being able to name these players, this is part of our craft. This is the community that we're in. And I think having a working knowledge and an interest in, participating in learning about our community and tracking details like this is particularly important if you want to do this for a career. Food for thought. Here's a new one, another question. Why are Bach Mount Vernon trombones so much better than the normal Bach trombones? Better? I don't know about better, but different, sure. So I play a Bach Mount Vernon, as everybody on the internet loves to remind me because I post photos of it all the time because it's so pretty. My Bach Mount Vernon I bought from Toby Oft in 2017. It is from 1963, right at the end of the Mount Vernon era. So here's the deal with Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is a town just north of New York City, very close to where I live, actually. From 1953 to 1963-ish, Vincent Bach's company was making trombones in Mount Vernon because they'd outgrown their shop in the Bronx. At this time, the craftsmen had really figured out what they were doing. They had a really elite team of craftsmen that were making instruments by hand. And this was the 50s. Con Selmer picked them up, and they moved the factory out to Elkhart. And that reopening happened probably by 65. I'm not positive on this. I talked to Ted Wagoner once, who is kind of the resident historian of Bach. He was the shop manager for a long time, for like 50 years or something. Ted basically told me all of this. And, when they moved to Elkhart, many of the factory craftsmen retired because they didn't want to move. And those that went out trained a new group of techs on how to do those horns. And so many of the early Elkhart horns from like the mid 60s that were the first instruments made in Elkhart were excellent because a couple of those older techs were still working on them. And they were training new people. And, some of the new people did horns and those maybe aren't as good as those. And that's why the early Elkharts are kind of hit or miss. You got to try them. But eventually, the newer craftsmen figured it out and took over. And then that became the Bach factory that, continued to produce Bach. But the stigma around Mount Vernon is it's partially that the alloy of the Mount Vernon yellow brass, most yellow brass is like 70-30, right? Ratio of copper to zinc. And I've heard speculation and stories that the Mount Vernon brass was like 72-28 rather than 70-30. So there's a little more copper, a little bit closer to red, a little warmer sound. I don't know. I mean, some of it is stigma, some of it is hand craftsman quality. There's a bunch of short answers, and some of them are literal and some of them are legend. But it's definitely true that the Bach Mount Vernon era trombones are prized because they generally do play really, really well. Mine follows that rule. It's an unbelievable instrument. I've tried many, many, many trombones, and some of them are quite different than this, but none are better. Just different. My trombone has been played by many big professionals, and nearly every time someone tries it, they offer me cash for it. So it's a good instrument, and I'm honored to caretake it. And it's an heirloom at this point. It's almost 70 years old. So I treat it like an artifact, and it's truly a blessing and a privilege to play it. Let's see if we can get one more here. How did you prepare for your DMA audition at NEC? Well, here's the honest answer. Twice. I prepared twice because I did not get in the first time, and I auditioned twice. And this is an important thing to share because the audition for the DMA at NEC is really frickin' hard. If I'm being super honest, there's a reason that for like 15 years there were no trombonists at NEC for the DMA. It's not because they weren't trying, it's because it's really, really hard. And that's because the way the program is structured right now, all the DMAs compete for the same spots, so it's pianists and violinists and trombonists and vocalists all competing for a certain number of spots, and their scores are all aggregated against each other. So you have to really, really score well on the test, and you have to score a very high score on the audition. So the first time I auditioned, I really prepared my butt off, and I went in and I passed the tests, which was really cool. And I auditioned, and I I think I got a high enough score to be accepted. I'm not positive, but I did not get a high enough score to be accepted when compared against all the other DMA students of different instruments. I was not in the top 6 or 7 or 8 or however many they took. So I took a year off and then re-auditioned because I really wanted to study with Steve for a DMA. And so the second time I did it, I was very fortunate and I played better and I'd, gotten better, and I'd had lessons with Steve, so that helped because I really had figured out some of the problems in my playing. And, Steve's just a master teacher, truly is. And I was very fortunate to be accepted with some scholarship money, so I was able to swing it. And the preparation was about patience and humility. Failing was really an important part of the process because NEC is a place where if you go for a graduate or a DMA degree, you're going to be surrounded by undergrads that play as well or better than you do. The level of playing is very high, particularly for older undergrads. It's a very high level of playing. And so if you're going to join a studio in a culture like this, you have to swallow your ego and you have to go in prepared to just learn from everybody and understand that, yeah, you're surrounded by greatness, true greatness. And it's a privilege to be there, but you're not trying to impress anybody. You're trying to just get as good as you can and really work hard at battling the demons that you carry. And that includes those technical deficiencies that you maybe sweep under the rug. Me personally, when I was younger, I was a terrible high range player. Now I don't struggle at all with high range, but I really struggle with articulation speed. My tongue has just slowed down as I've gotten older, and I really have to work my butt off to keep up. And so the humility of that reality helps me stay working. And you stay optimistic, being around students that are really great players, and you can certainly pick their brains, asking questions of young players that are really just phenomenally talented and hardworking. You'll often get answers that you might not get from teachers. So that's really interesting to mine for answers and for data. My DMA prep involved a lot of recording mock auditions. It involved a lot of long practice sessions where I was doing very short single things for like 10 minutes at a time. It involved a lot of brain practicing where I was singing and conducting. It involved a lot of singing and snapping to backbeats with excerpts. It involved some research. And then there was the studying, because for a DMA, you have to take an exam. The comprehensive exams at NEC were 8 hours. One was a theory exam and one was a history exam, and they were on the same day. One morning, no, I'm sorry, that's a lie. They were on next to each other days. It was like Tuesday, Wednesday. And one was at 2 p.m. and then the next one was at 10 a.m. So I auditioned on a Monday and I took an exam on a Tuesday and I took an exam on a Wednesday. So you cannot just practice for the audition, take the audition, and then stop playing for 2 months and study. You have to have it all at the same time. And that was very stressful. So I basically treated studying like practicing. And that went into the sequence as well. You're probably sick of hearing me talk by now. A lot of questions here answered. I hope it's been helpful. These grab bags are always really exciting. Next time I'll have a really productive co-host on, and we can have a little bit more discussion about these. But for today, I think we're all wishing Kevin huge congratulations on the birth of his daughter. And for the rest of you, have a wonderful week. Happy practicing, and I'll talk